Daniel had always preferred quiet corners, in cafes, on trains, even in life itself. The less attention drawn to him, the better. It wasn't shyness exactly, but more a quiet choice, the way some men prefer shade to sunlight. That was why he had picked a middle-row seat, 1-4C, when booking his flight. Not too close to the front, where business travelers hurried in and out. Not too close to the back, where the lavatories meant constant traffic. Row 14 was his compromise. Not special, not memorable, just where he wanted to be. The cabin hummed with the low drone of jet engines as passengers settled into their seats. Families wrestled with carry-ons. Business travelers already had laptops open, and a toddler near the back announced his displeasure to the world. The air smelled faintly of coffee, recycled air, and the distant whiff of jet fuel that clung to every flight. To most, it was an ordinary evening on an ordinary journey. To Daniel, it was another stretch of hours in the limbo of air travel, detached from Earth, suspended between time zones, waiting. He had brought a book with him, one he had meant to finish weeks ago. The cover was already creased, the edges frayed from being carried but not read. As he flipped it open, his eyes traced the words, but they didn't stick. He found himself distracted by the conversations around him, by the clinking of plastic cups, by the restless shifting of bodies confined too tightly together. Travel, he thought, had a way of showing people's raw selves, the impatient, the restless, the cheerful, the frightened. To his right sat a woman in her 30s, tapping at her phone, earbuds in place. She hardly looked up, her focus sealed to the glowing screen. On his left, across the aisle, a father entertained his young daughter with drawings on a napkin. Their laughter softened the sterility of the cabin, reminding Daniel of warmth beyond metal walls. The flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, their practiced smiles unwavering. They helped stow bags, answered questions, and calmed nerves with professional grace. To Daniel, it was all background noise, the choreography of flight that he had seen countless times before. He wasn't here for novelty. He was here to get from point A to point B with as little disruption as possible. As the safety demonstration played, he half listened, half daydreamed. He had been trained in emergencies for years as a paramedic, but here he was just another passenger. Here he wanted to leave that part of himself tucked away, at least for a while. He leaned back as the engines roared louder, felt the thrust push him against the seat, and watched the runway lights blur into streaks of gold. Takeoff always carried a thrill, even for someone like him. The earth fell away, buildings shrank into toy blocks, and the night sky opened its arms. He pressed his forehead briefly against the cool window, gazing at the faint glow of cities below. Then, with a deep breath, he pulled the book closer and tried again to read. Time passed in the strange rhythm of flights. Drinks were served, trays clattered, conversations rose and fell. Daniel ordered water, nothing more. He sipped slowly, eyes occasionally drifting to the flight map on the screen ahead. Miles ticked by in silence. For once, he was not the one expected to act, to respond, to make choices under pressure. He was just Daniel, a man in row 14, invisible, anonymous. But anonymity has a way of being fragile. As the plane leveled at cruising altitude, the cabin settled into its uneasy peace. The woman beside him finally put her phone away. The little girl across the aisle fell asleep with her head on her father's arm, and the hum of the engines became almost hypnotic. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself drift into thought. He imagined the hours ahead as uneventful, maybe finishing a few chapters, maybe dozing off, maybe nothing at all. He didn't know that fate was already rearranging itself. 2 rows ahead, unnoticed by most, an elderly man shifted in his seat, his breathing uneven. His wife, sitting beside him, placed a hand on his arm, whispering his name. His face was pale, his lips losing color. She pressed the call button frantically, her voice rising in alarm. A flight attendant hurried forward, her practiced composure faltering when she saw him slump sideways, unresponsive. Daniel, eyes still closed, didn't notice at first. The book lay open in his lap, a prop to his attempt at quiet detachment. Around him, though, a ripple of unease was spreading. Heads turned. Passengers leaned into the aisle. The familiar rhythm of the cabin broke, replaced by a new energy, sharp, urgent, electric. Then came the voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain spoke over the intercom, his tone steady but edged with urgency. "If there is a doctor or medical professional on board, please make yourself known immediately." The words pierced the cabin. Gasps followed. Whispers rushed like wind through the rows. Mothers held children closer. Couples exchanged worried glances. For a moment, it felt as though the air itself had thinned. Daniel's eyes opened. His body stiffened. He knew that tone, not from captains, but from dispatchers, from voices on radios calling for help in the dead of night. It was the tone that separated ordinary moments from extraordinary ones, the sound of life asking for intervention. He looked around. No one moved. The silence was louder than the engines now. Passengers glanced at each other, waiting for someone else to stand, for someone else to carry the burden. Seconds stretched unbearably, and in row 14, Daniel felt the weight settle on him. He didn't move yet, though. He sat still, heart thudding, caught between two selves, the man who wanted nothing but peace, and the medic who had sworn an oath long ago to answer when lives hung in the balance. He knew deep down that the choice wasn't really a choice at all. His training, his years of experience, his very instincts, they would not let him sit quietly now. The captain's request still echoed in the cabin, unanswered. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, the tension mounting. Daniel inhaled deeply, feeling the knot tighten in his chest. Row 14 had been meant to be a seat of invisibility. Instead, it was about to become the center of everything. And as he unbuckled his seatbelt and rose to his feet, every eye turned toward him. The quiet man of row 14 was about to become something else entirely. The cabin, moments ago buzzing with the soft chatter of travelers, slipped into an unnatural stillness. Passengers who had been laughing, eating, or dozing suddenly froze. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Even the toddler in the back, who had been fussing since takeoff, went quiet, as though the air itself commanded silence. The captain's voice lingered in the pressurized cabin like a weight. "If there is a doctor or medical professional on board, please make yourself known immediately." It was the kind of announcement no one ever wanted to hear. A woman's cry punctured the silence, sharp, panicked. 2 rows ahead, the elderly man slumped deeper in his seat. His wife clutched his arm desperately, her eyes wide, her voice trembling as she repeated his name, pleading for him to respond. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the call button again and again, as though pressing it harder might summon more help. The nearest flight attendant hurried forward, her polished composure faltering when she saw his condition. Kneeling awkwardly, in the cramped space, she pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse, her lips tightening. She looked back toward her colleague with alarm. "Get the kit." The aisle became a river of whispers. Strangers leaned into view, necks craning, whispers darting like sparks. What happened? Is he breathing? Does anyone know what's going on? Daniel sat frozen in row 14. His heart drummed against his ribs, loud enough he thought others might hear it. He had heard this sound before, not in airplanes, but in ambulances, in apartments where families wailed, on street corners where accidents had turned ordinary days into chaos. The sound wasn't in his ears, but in his blood, a thrum of crisis. He hadn't wanted it here. He stared at the seat in front of him, at the small safety card tucked into its pocket, as if avoiding the scene might erase it. For months he had told himself he needed a break, from the calls, from the endless emergencies, from carrying other people's worst days on his shoulders. This trip had been meant as an escape. Just Daniel, invisible in row 14. No sirens. No rushing. No one depending on him. But life, it seemed, had different plans. The captain's voice repeated, firmer now. Any medical professionals on board, please identify yourselves. Still, no one moved. The silence deepened. A woman in the back clutched her chest, muttering prayers under her breath. A man across the aisle whispered to his wife, "There has to be someone." But row after row remained motionless. Passengers glanced at each other, eyes searching, waiting for a hand to rise, for a savior to reveal themselves. Daniel's throat tightened. He could feel the moment pressing against him, urgent and insistent. He tried to reason with himself. What if there is a doctor, and they're just slow to respond? What if the attendants have it under control? What if? But the truth clawed through the excuses. He knew the look of crisis, the tilt of the head, the pallor of skin that meant blood wasn't flowing as it should. He knew what failing vitals looked like. The man up there wasn't just fainting from fatigue or dizziness. This was serious. This was life on the edge of slipping away. Daniel shifted in his seat, hands trembling slightly. He could feel the eyes of nearby passengers flickering toward him. Perhaps it was his body language, the way he leaned forward instinctively. Perhaps it was just coincidence. But in that charged moment, he felt as though the entire row, maybe the entire cabin, sensed he might be the one. His neighbor pulled out an earbud, glancing at him with curious, almost questioning eyes. Across the aisle, the father with the little girl was watching him too. Daniel exhaled sharply, pressing his palms to his thighs. He didn't want this. Not here, not now. But the image of the man's wife haunted him already, her trembling voice, her desperate hands. He had seen that look countless times before, the helplessness of someone watching the person they loved vanish in front of them. It was a look that branded itself onto your memory. You could never forget it, no matter how much you wanted to. The flight attendant's voice carried down the aisle, strained. "We need assistance," she called, louder than the captain's calm announcement. Her desperation cut through the whispers. That was it. Daniel knew he couldn't sit any longer. His seatbelt buckle clicked open, a sound small but decisive. He rose to his feet, the world around him blurring into still faces and wide eyes. The transformation was instant. Gasps rippled through the cabin, passengers shifting as though collectively relieved. The tension that had held them taut released slightly, hope flickering in their expressions. The quiet man from row 14, the one who had been nothing more than another traveler among many, was suddenly more. A flight attendant spotted him and rushed forward, gratitude flashing in her eyes. "Are you medical?" she asked quickly. Daniel nodded once. "Paramedic," he said, his voice steady, though his chest felt like a storm. "Thank God," she breathed, motioning for him to follow. "This way." The aisle parted like water. Around him, passengers pulled in their elbows, shifted their knees, whispering as he passed. Some murmured prayers, others just stared. To them, he was no longer invisible. He was possibility. He was the answer to the captain's call. As Daniel moved forward, he caught glimpses of the man slumped in his seat, his gray skin, his limp arm, the frantic wife, whispering his name over and over. Daniel's pulse quickened. He knew already, this would not be easy. The cramped space, the limited equipment, the altitude, all of it stacked against him. Still, his training clicked into place. A man from row 14, a man who had craved silence and anonymity, began to shift into someone else. The medic who had faced dozens of crises, who had steadied his hands against panic before. But in the seconds before he reached the collapsed passenger, Daniel allowed himself one last flicker of doubt. One last whispered thought. What if I fail? What if he dies here, in front of them all, despite everything I try? He clenched his jaw, burying the thought as quickly as it came. He couldn't afford doubt. Not now. He leaned down beside the man, meeting the wife's tear-filled eyes. I'm here to help, he said, his voice low but firm. And as he placed his fingers against the man's neck, searching for a pulse, the cabin seemed to hold its breath with him. The flight was no longer routine. The journey was no longer ordinary. Row 14 had changed everything. The aisle narrowed as Daniel stepped forward, every row of passengers turning to follow his movements. It was strange, he thought. Just seconds ago, he had been invisible, another nameless figure among hundreds. Now he was the focal point of the entire cabin, their unspoken expectation clinging to him like gravity. The flight attendant hurried beside him, clearing the path with urgent gestures. Please, let him through. Make way. Passengers tucked elbows in, pulled bags tighter against their legs, and pressed shoulders to the walls of the cabin. Their whispers filled the air like static. He's a medic. Thank God someone's here. Maybe he can save him. Daniel's steps felt heavier than they should, as though the aisle stretched longer than it really was. He could see the collapsed man ahead now, his wife gripping his hand, her face streaked with panic. She looked up at Daniel with the kind of desperate hope that can crush or fortify a man. By the time he reached row 12, his mind had shifted gears. The medic inside him was awake now, instincts overriding fear. Years of training and muscle memory clicked into place. He crouched quickly, his knees pressing against the hard floor of the cramped aisle. The man was slumped, head tilted back unnaturally, lips tinged with blue. His chest rose shallowly, erratically. The wife's voice quavered. He's not answering me. He was fine. He was fine a minute ago. Daniel nodded sharply, keeping his tone firm, steady, controlled. I need space. Please. The surrounding passengers immediately pulled back, their fear transforming into obedience. Even the wife released her husband's arm slightly, though her trembling hand never left his shoulder. Daniel reached for the man's wrist, fingers pressing against the artery, feeling for the familiar throb of life. Nothing. He shifted to the neck, pressing harder, his eyes narrowing in focus. There it was, faint, weak, but present. Pulse is low, he muttered, half to himself, half to the flight attendant hovering anxiously with the first aid kit. He glanced up, locking eyes with her. I need oxygen and a defibrillator now. She nodded briskly, already signaling to another attendant who disappeared down the aisle at a near run. Daniel's hands moved quickly, loosening the man's collar, tilting his head to keep the airway open. He scanned the limited supplies the attendant handed him. A small oxygen tank with a basic mask, a blood pressure cuff, some rudimentary monitoring. Tools, far less than what he would have in the back of an ambulance. Far less than he wanted, but it would have to do. Sir, can you hear me? Daniel called, his voice firm, sharp, meant to cut through unconsciousness. No response. The man's chest stuttered, his breathing shallow and inconsistent. The wife's tears flowed freely now, her voice breaking. Please, don't let him die. Daniel didn't look at her. He couldn't. He had learned long ago that in moments like this, the emotions of family could drown you. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on the patient, the task, the small victories, and urgent calculations. His voice softened only slightly. "I'll do everything I can." The oxygen mask was in his hand now. He slipped it over the man's face, adjusted the flow. The hiss of air filled the silence, a sound both fragile and powerful. The man's chest rose a little more steadily. The defibrillator arrived, a bulky, portable unit, its bright casing stark against the dim cabin lighting. Daniel flicked. It opened with practiced speed, pulling out the pads. His hands moved in a blur, stripping the man's shirt aside, pressing the pads against his chest. The device whirred to life, scanning the rhythm of a faltering heart. Passengers craned from every angle, holding their breath as though they too were being measured. The cabin was no longer a collection of strangers. It was a single organism, its heart in crisis, its collective fate tied to the man on the floor. Daniel glanced at the flight attendant. "Clear everyone back." She raised her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay seated and away from the aisle." The machine beeped. A jagged rhythm appeared on its screen. Irregular, unstable, teetering on the edge of collapse. Not shockable yet, Daniel realized, but dangerous. He applied compressions anyway, his arms pumping with controlled precision, his body leaning in despite the tight space. Each push was a demand, a command for the heart to fight. The wife sobbed beside him, her hand covering her mouth. A teenage boy across the aisle whispered prayers under his breath, his fingers clenched tight around a rosary. A businessman, too. Rose back muttered, come on, as though sheer will might help. But Daniel blocked them all out. His world had narrowed to the rise and fall of the man's chest, the flicker of numbers on the defibrillator, the measured rhythm of compressions. Minutes stretched endlessly. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his muscles straining. He thought briefly of row 14, of the book still lying open on his seat. He had wanted nothing but silence. Instead, he was here, kneeling in the aisle, holding a stranger's life in his hands. The flight attendant knelt beside him, her voice low. "Do you need us to prepare for an emergency landing?" Daniel didn't look up. "Not yet," he said, his voice clipped, breathless from exertion. "Give me a few more minutes." Her nod was almost imperceptible, but her trust was clear. She would follow his lead. The man's chest rose again, fuller this time, steadier. Daniel paused compressions, eyes darting to the monitor. The rhythm had shifted, still unstable, but stronger than before. A thin thread of relief cut through the tension in his chest. He adjusted the oxygen, checked the pulse again. Faint, but there. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The wife's sobs turned into whispered gratitude. The teenage boy muttered. Louder prayers now, words of thanks. Even the flight attendants exchanged brief glances of hope. Daniel allowed himself only a second of relief. This wasn't over, not by a long stretch. But it was a step. A fragile foothold on the edge of disaster. He glanced up at the passengers for the first time, meeting their eyes. Their faces reflected awe, fear, hope, desperation, all directed at him. He felt the weight of it settle deeper. In this metal tube, 35,000 feet above the ground, he wasn't just a medic anymore. He was their anchor, their answer, their fragile line between safety and catastrophe. A quiet man from row 14 was gone. In his place stood Daniel, the medic, the lifeline, the reluctant hero rising to the moment. The cabin was too small, too narrow, too crowded. Daniel felt it instantly, the suffocating lack of space, the way every movement had to be calculated, every adjustment of his knees or elbows requiring a shuffle from others. He had worked. In alleys, in cars, in bathrooms barely large enough to kneel inside, but this was different. The airplane wasn't just cramped, it was unforgiving. There was no way to call for backup, no hospital waiting just minutes away. Here, thousands of feet in the air, he was the only line between life and death. The defibrillator's monitor continued its uneasy stutter of waves, sharp peaks followed by terrifying flat stretches. The man's pulse wavered beneath Daniel's. Fingers, weak, unreliable, fragile. Daniel's brain spun through scenarios, recalling protocols drilled into him through years of practice. But every solution was met with the same wall: limited resources. The oxygen tank hissed softly beside him, its small size mocking his urgency. The mask covered the man's mouth and nose, but Daniel knew the supply wouldn't last long. He needed better monitoring tools, medications, IV access, none of which he had. All he had was a metal kit stocked for surface wounds and headaches, not for a heart that was threatening to stop. "Stay with me," he muttered under his breath, as though the man could hear. "Come on, fight." A sudden jolt rattled the cabin. Turbulence. The overhead bins shook, a few latches clicking ominously. Passengers gasped, hands clutching armrests. The plane steadied again after a shiver, but the interruption drove home how precarious his work really was. A sharp bump at the wrong second could rip the pads from the man's chest, could shove Daniel off balance, could cost them precious seconds. "Captain says turbulence may continue," a flight attendant whispered urgently. She braced herself against the seat while keeping her eyes locked on Daniel. "Do you want him to consider diverting?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Not. Yet, I need to stabilize him before we risk descent." His voice was steady, but his gut churned. He had been on calls where minutes decided everything. In the air, those minutes were amplified into eternity. He resumed compressions, leaning his body weight into the rhythm. Push, release, push, release. His arms screamed in protest, but his training drowned out the pain. Sweat rolled down his temple, dripping onto the man's shirt. He ignored it. His focus narrowed to the motion of his hands, the slight recoil of ribs beneath his palms. "Sir, can I help?" The voice came from behind. Daniel looked up briefly. A young woman, early 20s, leaned forward from her seat, her phone flashlight already in her hand. Her expression trembled between fear and determination. "Hold the light steady," Daniel ordered without hesitation. She nodded, angling the beam onto the patient's chest. The glow sharpened Daniel's view of the pads, the movement of the man's chest. Another voice, deeper, older. "I'm not a medic, but I know CPR, if you need relief." Daniel's eyes flickered to a man in a business suit, his tie loosened, his face pale but earnest. For a heartbeat, Daniel considered it. His own arms trembled with fatigue, but then he shook his head. "Not yet. Stay close in case." The businessman nodded firmly, his knuckles white as he gripped the seat in front of him, waiting. It was then that Daniel noticed the passengers around him, not just watching engaged. A mother held her child back gently, but firmly, whispering reassurances while keeping the aisle clear. A man handed tissues to the sobbing wife. A teenager prayed, aloud, his voice shaky but constant. The cabin was no longer just an audience. It was a community, fragile but united. Still, the pressure was his alone. The monitor beeped, its jagged line shifting again, threatening to flatten. Daniel's stomach lurched. "Charging," he snapped, his voice louder than intended. The defibrillator whirred, a rising tone that drew gasps from nearby passengers. "Clear," Daniel commanded. The young woman with the phone jumped back, nearly dropping it. The businessman pulled the wife away gently, her cries muffled against his sleeve. The shock discharged. The man's body jerked violently, then stilled. For a heartbeat, a literal one, there was nothing. Silence. Every passenger in the cabin seemed to hold their own breath, waiting for the verdict written in electronic beeps. Then, beep. Pause, beep, another. Daniel exhaled, almost collapsing. With relief, a rhythm was there. Not strong, not perfect, but present. He adjusted the oxygen, listening to the hiss, watching the chest rise again. "Come on," he whispered, softer now. "You've got this." The wife, shaking uncontrollably, leaned forward. Is he alive?" Daniel looked at her directly for the first time. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes swollen from crying. He nodded once. "Yes, for now, but he's not stable." The words hung between them. Fragile hope, fragile truth. She clutched her husband's hand tighter, sobbing with relief. Daniel leaned back slightly, rolling his aching shoulders. His arms burned from compressions. His knees ached from kneeling on the unyielding floor, but he couldn't stop. He kept one hand on the man's wrist, monitoring the pulse, the other adjusting the oxygen flow. A flight attendant crouched. Again, "Should I tell the captain to divert now?" Daniel hesitated. His eyes flicked to the monitor, then to the oxygen tank's gauge. The supply was already lower than he liked. If the man relapsed, they'd be in trouble. Yet landing a plane in emergency conditions carried risks too. Weather, fuel, air, traffic. He weighed it all in a split second, his mind racing. "Tell him to be ready," Daniel said finally. "But don't divert yet, not until we have to." She nodded, her face pale but resolute. Another tremor of turbulence rippled through the cabin. Daniel pressed harder against the man's chest, bracing himself. The plane steadied, but it reminded him again, they weren't on solid ground. Every decision was magnified by altitude. The passengers hadn't stopped watching. Some whispered encouragements under their breath. Others pressed hands together in prayer. It was as though the entire cabin was tethered to the man on the floor. Every beep of the monitor echoed in their own hearts. Daniel knew this wasn't over. Stabilization wasn't victory. It was a fragile pause, a truce between life and death. At any second, the rhythm could falter again, and he'd have to dive back into compressions, shocks, desperate improvisations. But for now, there was breath. There was a pulse. There was a thread of hope. Daniel wiped his forehead with his sleeve, his breath ragged. He looked around briefly, catching the eyes of the passengers closest to him. Their gazes were filled with gratitude, awe, and fear. He almost wanted to tell them the truth, that he was as scared as they were, that his arms ached, that every decision felt like a gamble. But he couldn't. They needed him to be more than human right now. They needed him to be steady, unshakable. So he forced his voice calm as he said, "He's stable for the moment. Let's keep it that way." And as he leaned back over the man, listening to the rhythm of the beeps and the hiss of oxygen, Daniel realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. Row 14 was gone. He wasn't a passenger anymore. He was the medic, the lifeline, the one carrying them all at 35,000 feet. The oxygen hissed softly, steady but fragile, like a lifeline stretched thin. Daniel's eyes remained locked on the monitor, the green peaks and valleys that told him just how close they were to losing this battle. Every beep mattered. Every hesitation mattered. He couldn't let himself drift, not even for a second. But as he worked, he became aware of something strange unfolding around him. The cabin, a place usually filled with the impatient sighs of travelers, the hum of private conversations, the clicking of keyboards, had transformed. It wasn't a collection of strangers anymore. It was a single body, tense, focused, alive with shared purpose. "Do you need more light?" the young woman with the phone asked, her voice trembling but steady enough. She had been holding her flashlight aimed at the patient's chest for what felt like an eternity, her hand shaking from fatigue but refusing to lower it. Daniel nodded once. "Keep it steady. You're doing great." The praise lit something in her eyes, and she tightened her grip on the phone, adjusting her position to make sure the beam hit exactly where Daniel needed it. Behind her, the businessman who had offered help earlier leaned forward again. His jacket was off now, sleeves rolled up, sweat beading on his forehead, even though he wasn't the one kneeling on the floor. "If you need compressions, I can take over," he said firmly. Daniel studied him quickly. The man's breathing was rapid, his face pale, but there was no hesitation in his voice. Daniel nodded. "Not yet, but stay close." "Yes, sir," the man replied, as if Daniel were suddenly a captain himself. From farther back, a mother with 2 children stood halfway in the aisle, her eyes darting nervously between Daniel and her kids. She tore her scarf from her neck and offered it forward. "If you need to prop his head, use this." Daniel almost refused. Instinct told him to rely only on medical tools, but he caught himself. These people weren't just passengers anymore. They were part of this fight. He took the scarf with a brief nod. "Thank you." The woman's shoulders sagged with relief, as though just being part of the effort steadied her own fear. Row after row, the energy shifted. People passed tissues, bottles of water, anything they thought might be useful. A teenager crouched by the aisle, murmuring prayers in a steady rhythm, his voice oddly calming against the beeps of the monitor. Another passenger, a nurse, though not trained for emergencies of this scale, hovered nearby, offering to check vitals if Daniel's hands were full. The cabin crew, too, worked with quiet intensity. One attendant secured the area, politely, but firmly keeping passengers back. Another organized the supplies, laying them out neatly beside Daniel so he wouldn't have to fumble. Their training showed, but more than that, their humanity shone through. This wasn't a drill anymore. This was life, fragile and trembling in their care. Daniel felt it, the shift. He wasn't alone. "Pulse is weak, but it's there," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. His hands adjusted the oxygen flow again, watching for the rise and fall of the man's chest. "We just need to keep him steady." The wife, who had been weeping uncontrollably minutes before, leaned closer, her tears quieter now. She looked at Daniel as if he were holding not just her husband's life, but hers too. Is he going to make it?" Daniel hesitated. He had learned long ago not to promise outcomes he couldn't control. But he also knew what hope did in moments like this. He met her eyes, his voice steady. "He's fighting, and he's not alone." The words rippled outward, as though carried on invisible air. Heads nodded, hands pressed together. Even the quietest passengers, those who hadn't spoken at all, leaned forward slightly, as though their very bodies were leaning into the fight. The plane jolted again with a patch of turbulence. Gasps rippled, hands clutched at armrests. Daniel steadied himself quickly, keeping the oxygen mask secure. "We're okay," he said firmly, more to the passengers than to himself. "Stay calm." It was then that he realized something extraordinary. Normally, in crises, chaos spread. Panic, shouting, frantic movements. But here, in this metal tube soaring through the night sky, chaos had given way to unity. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had reshaped itself into purpose. The businessman crouched lower, ready to jump in. The young woman's flashlight beam stayed unwavering despite her aching hand. The praying teenager whispered louder now, his voice almost a chant. The mother with children stroked her daughter's hair while keeping her eyes on Daniel, silently, offering strength. Every single one of them was with him. Daniel swallowed hard, pushing away the knot in his throat. He couldn't let the emotion show, not now. But inside, he felt it. The weight of being the center had shifted slightly. It wasn't all on him anymore. He was still the medic, the hands on the chest, the voice giving orders. But he wasn't carrying this man alone. The entire cabin carried him. Minutes dragged like hours. Each beep from the monitor was a cliffhanger. The rhythm rose, dipped, threatened to falter, then steadied again. Daniel's arms trembled, his muscles screaming from strain. Finally, he nodded toward the businessman. Your turn. Keep compression steady. 30, then stop. A man moved instantly, sliding into position. His hands were awkward at first, the angle strange in the cramped aisle, but determination replaced inexperience. Daniel guided him with calm instructions. Good. Harder. Keep the rhythm. Perfect. Don't stop until I say. Sweat streamed down the man's face, his tie swinging loosely as he pumped with all his strength. Around him, passengers whispered encouragement. The wife reached out to touch his arm briefly, whispering thank yous through her tears. Daniel used a brake to check the oxygen tank again, calculate how much time they had before it ran dry. Too little. He checked the pulse, adjusted the mask, re-evaluated the monitor. Then he took over compressions again, his arms heavy but precise. Back and forth they went, strangers and medic, alternating in the desperate rhythm of survival. And with each cycle, Daniel noticed it, the patient's chest rising more steadily, the pulse under his fingers holding firmer, the rhythm on the monitor gaining strength. A murmur spread through the cabin, cautious, fragile, but undeniable. Hope. The wife's tears turned to whispered prayers of gratitude. The young woman with the flashlight whispered, "He's stronger, isn't he?" Daniel only nodded, but the relief in his eyes was enough. For the first time since the captain's call, Daniel felt the possibility of victory. Not certainty, never certainty, but possibility. And as he looked around at the faces surrounding him, the faces of strangers who had become comrades, in this battle, he realized something profound. At 35,000 feet, where fear should have fractured them, the cabin had become something else. A family, temporary but fierce. A crew of ordinary people bound together not by destination, but by the urgent fight for one man's life. A cabin united. A cabin felt suspended between two worlds, the humming normalcy of air travel and the raw edge of crisis. Daniel wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, forcing himself to focus on the pulse beneath his fingers. It was there, fragile, but undeniable, fluttering like the wings of a moth against glass. He adjusted the oxygen mask again, measuring each rise and fall of the man's chest. The relief that had washed over the passengers minutes earlier was already thinning. Hope, they realized, could be as fragile as the pulse itself. And then came the question. "Sir," a flight attendant whispered urgently, crouching beside him. Her face was pale, lips pressed tight as she tried to stay professional. "The captain needs to know. Should we divert? There's an airfield about 40 minutes off course. He needs your call." Daniel froze for just a moment. 40 minutes. In medical terms, that was a lifetime or a death sentence. The patient wasn't stable enough to last hours, but moving hundreds of lives for one man came with risks too. Turbulence, fuel, weather conditions. An emergency landing wasn't a guarantee of safety. The wife, kneeling nearby, heard the words. Her eyes widened, and she clutched Daniel's sleeve with trembling fingers. "Please," she begged, her voice hoarse, "get him on the ground." "He can't wait." Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her yes, to promise her that landing would save her husband. But he also knew the truth. A rushed descent could make things worse. Altitude changes strained weak hearts. Panic could spiral. And if the weather was as bad as the attendant hinted, landing might put every single passenger at risk. For the first time since stepping forward from row 14, Daniel felt the weight of command, not just over a patient, but over an entire plane. He looked at the monitor again. The heart rhythm was erratic, threatening to collapse but holding. He pressed his stethoscope to the man's chest, listening for the faint whisper of life beneath skin and bone. Weak, yes, but still there. Should I tell the captain? The attendant pressed, urgency sharpening her whisper. Daniel inhaled slowly, his mind racing through every calculation. He remembered hospital ERS, where seconds decided fates. He remembered field emergencies, where he had only his hands and instincts. And he remembered the oath he had taken not to play God, but to give every chance he could. Not yet, Daniel said finally, his voice low but firm. Give me 2 more minutes. The attendant blinked at him, startled by the calm certainty. Passengers, overhearing, stilled again, their whispers dying into silence. The wife clutched her husband's hand tighter, as if willing Daniel's decision into truth. 2 minutes. A gamble, but one he had to take. Daniel leaned back into the work, every motion precise. He adjusted the oxygen again, lifted the man's chin, ensuring the airways stayed clear. He pressed his fingers against the carotid, counting silently. Weak, still weak. The businessman, crouched close by, spoke in a low, tense voice. If you're wrong, we lose him. Daniel didn't look up. If I'm wrong, an emergency landing might kill all of us. I can keep him alive here. The man swallowed, but he didn't argue again. Something in Daniel's tone had silenced him, not arrogance, but a steady belief that steadied others too. Daniel glanced at the defibrillator. They had already shocked him once earlier. Another shock now could either reset the heart or stop it altogether. His mind ran through the probabilities, the risks, the options that narrowed with each passing second. Then it happened, the monitor alarmed, the rhythm stuttering dangerously. Gasps filled the cabin. The wife sobbed, covering her mouth with both hands. Stay back, Daniel commanded sharply. His voice cut through the panic, steady, anchoring. He reached for the paddles again, his movements fluid, controlled. Charging, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His thumb pressed the button. The device whined, and then, clear. The man's body jerked as the shock surged through him. For an agonizing second, the monitor flatlined. Silence swallowed the cabin. And then beep. Another. Then another. The rhythm returned, faint, but there. A wave of gasps and whispered prayers filled the air. The wife collapsed against the seat, sobbing in relief. The young woman with the flashlight lowered it briefly, her free hand pressed against her chest, as though to keep her own heart steady. Daniel exhaled slowly, tension draining from his shoulders, but never fully leaving. He had bought them time, but only time. The attendant's radio crackled. Captain's asking again, do we divert? Daniel looked at the monitor, then at the wife, and at the rows of faces watching him like their fate hinged on his next word. And in a way, it did. He pictured the descent oxygen shifts, turbulence, panic. He pictured 40 minutes of steady compressions, of passengers holding lights and belts and hope. And he pictured landing on a strip of concrete in uncertain weather, where maybe, just maybe, a hospital waited. His hands trembled for the first time all night. We hold course, he said finally, his voice rough but resolute. He's stable enough for now. Tell the captain, keep flying. The attendant nodded, running the message back. There were murmurs in the cabin, some in relief, some in doubt. But no one challenged him. Not anymore. Daniel leaned back, his eyes locked on the man before him. Every breath, every beat, every flicker of green on the monitor reminded him that he had gambled with more than one life tonight. But in that gamble, he had chosen faith, in his training, in his hands, in the strangers who had rallied around him. And as the cabin settled back into tense silence, Daniel realized something. He wasn't just fighting for one life. He was holding the balance of them all at 35,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow as the captain's voice filled the intercom, calm, but carrying an edge that made everyone listen closely. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a priority descent. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Emergency personnel will be meeting us on the ground. Thank you for your cooperation. The words fell heavy, weighted with the urgency Daniel already knew was coming. He glanced at the monitor again. The heart rhythm remained fragile, but steady enough. The man wasn't out of danger, far from it, but he had bought them this descent. The engines hummed lower, the pitch of the plane shifting as they angled. Downward, pressure changed almost immediately. Ears popped. A few babies cried. Passengers gripped armrests, some whispering prayers, others sitting in rigid silence. Every person on that plane knew they were part of something bigger than themselves now. Daniel steadied the patient's head as the cabin tilted. Easy, he muttered, though the words were as much for himself as for the unconscious man. The oxygen mask hissed, feeding each breath with manufactured hope. He pressed 2 fingers against the carotid, again still there. Faint, but there. The wife clutched her husband's hand tightly, whispering his name over and over, as though the syllables alone could anchor him to life. Daniel caught her eye briefly. "Talk to him," he said softly. "He can hear you." Her tears spilled. Fresh, but she obeyed. She leaned close, her voice trembling but insistent. "You're not leaving me, do you hear? You're not leaving. We're almost there." Around them, the cabin had shifted into complete silence. No one was impatient anymore. No one complained about delays. It was as if time had frozen. Every soul on board caught in the fragile balance of one man's survival. The young woman with the flashlight had finally been allowed to lower her arm, replaced by a flight attendant holding a steadier beam. She rubbed her sore wrist, but her eyes never left the scene. The businessman, sleeves rolled and tie loosened, remained crouched nearby like a soldier waiting for his next order. Even the praying teenager continued his whispered rhythm, soft and steady, a heartbeat of its own. And Daniel? He was exhausted. His muscles burned, his shirt clung to his skin, his mind ached from calculating every risk, every possible outcome. But he couldn't rest. Not yet. The plane jolted suddenly, with turbulence sending gasps through the cabin. Daniel steadied himself instantly, pressing his palm against the seat for balance while keeping the oxygen secure. "Hold him steady," he barked, and the businessman moved quickly to support the patient's legs. The wife cried out, "Is he? He's okay," Daniel cut in firmly. "We've got him." "Stay calm." But inside, his heart thudded hard. Every jolt, every shift in air pressure could push the man's fragile heart past the point of no return. The descent stretched. Unlike an eternity, minutes felt like hours. The beeping monitor filled the cabin like a metronome of suspense. Passengers' breaths sensed to it, rising and falling with each fragile beat. And then, at last, the wheels screeched against the runway. A chorus of gasps, sobs, and relieved whispers broke out around them. But Daniel didn't celebrate yet. Survival wasn't guaranteed until skilled hands beyond his own could take over. "Stay seated," a flight attendant shouted, her voice firm but trembling with urgency. "Paramedics are boarding first." The cabin doors burst open. Cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the sharp smell of fuel and tarmac. And then came the sound of boots pounding up the narrow aisle. "Where's the patient?" A paramedic barked. His voice was brisk, professional, the tone of someone who had lived this scene many times before. "Here," Daniel called, raising a hand. The paramedics surged forward, equipment bags slamming against seats, voices rapid and coordinated. In seconds, Daniel was surrounded by a team that mirrored his own intensity. They moved with practiced precision, checking vitals, switching oxygen supplies, preparing a stretcher. For the first time all night, Daniel let himself pull back just slightly. His hands hovered, ready to assist, but he no longer carried the full weight alone. Relief mixed with something heavier, exhaustion, so deep it threatened to drop him right there in the aisle. The wife cried as the paramedics lifted her husband onto the stretcher, wires and tubes trailing like lifelines. She tried to follow, but a flight attendant gently held her back until the team signaled she could walk alongside. Daniel stayed crouched, catching his breath as the stretcher was rushed toward the exit. The businessman placed a hand on his shoulder. "You saved him." Daniel shook his head faintly. "We all did." The man's eyes glistened in the dim cabin light. He nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no further words. As the paramedics disappeared through the cabin door, passengers erupted into applause. It wasn't the cheerful clapping of a safe landing. It was raw, emotional, grateful, a thunderous release of everything they had held inside during those long, suspended hours. Daniel sat back against the seat, his head tilting upward as if only now remembering to breathe fully. The ovation washed over him, not as praise, but as a wave of humanity, strangers, connected forever by one night, one flight, one fragile heartbeat. He felt a hand slip into his. The young woman with the flashlight. Her grip was warm, firm. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes brimming with emotion. Daniel squeezed once, then released. No words were needed. Outside, the stretcher vanished into the flashing red lights of an ambulance. The night air swallowed it whole, taking with it the life Daniel had fought for, the life now in others' hands. The cabin slowly returned to order. Passengers unbuckled, gathered bags, spoke in hushed tones. But their glances lingered on Daniel, some in awe, some in gratitude, all in recognition. And Daniel? He pulled his jacket back on, smoothed his shirt, and sank quietly into his seat in row 14. Just another passenger once more. But deep inside, he knew he would never be just another passenger again. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the airport terminal in long golden streaks. Travelers bustled through, dragging suitcases, sipping coffee, rushing to connections. Life, relentless in its rhythm, moved forward as though nothing extraordinary had happened the night before. Daniel sat in a quiet corner near the window, a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hands. His body ached, every muscle reminding him of the hours he had spent bent over the patient in that cramped aisle. His eyes were heavy, but his mind refused to rest. Images replayed relentlessly, the wife's desperate gaze, the businessman's steady hands, the young woman's flashlight beam cutting through the dim cabin, and always, always, the fragile blip of the heart monitor. He hadn't gone to the hospital. Part of him had wanted to, but something stronger had pulled him back. This wasn't about recognition or thanks. It never had been. He was just a man in row 14 who had done what needed to be done. The rest belonged to others now. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Dr. Hall?" Daniel looked up, startled. It was the flight attendant who had crouched beside him during the crisis. Out of uniform now, her hair tied loosely. She looked almost unrecognizable from the composed professional she had been on the plane. She smiled, though her eyes carried the same exhaustion he felt. "I just wanted to say, thank you. Truly. We all saw what you did. Without you?" She stopped, shook her head, words failing her. Daniel managed a small smile. "I just did my job." She leaned forward slightly. "Most people wouldn't have. Not like that. You didn't just save him. You kept all of us calm. You carried us through." Her words struck something deep, but Daniel only nodded. He wasn't sure how to respond to the weight of gratitude. Before he could find an answer, Another voice joined, softer, trembling. "Dr. Hall?" The wife stood a few feet away, her eyes swollen from hours of tears, but shining now with something brighter hope. She clutched a folded hospital report in her hands. "He's alive," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's in the ICU. Stable. They said if it hadn't been for you, he never would have made it through the flight." Daniel's chest tightened. Relief, deep and unshakable, finally poured through him. The kind of relief he hadn't allowed himself on the plane, too focused on the fight to feel its meaning. The wife stepped closer, tears spilling again. She pressed the paper report to her chest. "You don't know me. But because of you, my children still have a father. I still have my husband. How do I ever thank you for that?" Daniel stood, slowly setting the coffee aside. He met her gaze, steady and gentle. "You don't have to. Just live. That's thanks enough." Her sobs broke free, and before he could step back, she embraced him fiercely, clutching him like a lifeline. He let her, awkward at first, then simply steady, offering the quiet strength she needed. When she finally pulled back, her smile through tears was radiant. She pressed his hand once, whispered thank you again, and left to rejoin her husband. At the hospital, Daniel sank back into his seat, heart heavy but lighter at the same time. For the rest of the day, he moved through the airport and into the city with a strange quietness in his soul. Strangers passed him, unaware. He could have been anyone, a man in a coat, a traveler between flights. No one would ever guess that just hours earlier, in a pressurized cabin above the clouds, he had fought for a heartbeat and won. Later, as the sun dipped low over the skyline, he found himself standing on a bridge overlooking the water. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and fuel, the mingling hum of city life. He thought of the man in the hospital bed, machines still whispering his fragile survival. He thought of the wife's trembling hands, the businessman's quiet nod, the young woman's whispered thank you. He thought of how, in one moment of crisis, complete strangers had become a team, bound together by urgency, fear, and fragile hope. And he thought of the silence afterward, the applause that wasn't about him, but about life itself, about the miracle of breath, of survival, of humanity standing together in the face of the unknown. Daniel closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the city fade into the memory of that cabin. He knew he would never see most of those passengers again. They would scatter back into their lives, telling stories of the night a man in row 14 stood, up when the captain asked for a medic. Maybe they would remember his name, maybe not, but they would remember what it felt like to be human together. That, Daniel realized, was enough. He opened his eyes, breathed deeply, and allowed the weight to settle not as a burden, but as a truth he could carry. He wasn't a hero. He was just a doctor who had answered when the moment demanded. And yet, somewhere in the quiet between heartbeat and silence, he understood something profound. Sometimes the smallest choices ripple far beyond us. Sometimes sitting quietly in row 14 is all it takes to change the ending of someone else's story. Daniel turned from the bridge and walked back into the city lights, blending into the crowd. Just another man in the world, anonymous again, but forever changed.